Good afternoon and welcome to today's event, Source Code. My name is Barry Pavel and I'm a Senior Vice President here at the Atlantic Council and the Director of our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Today we're very excited to debut an original short film, Source Code, which the Atlantic Council has produced. The film depicts the interface of human and machine at war in the year 2065. As the advent of artificial intelligence radically transforms defense and national security, the story of this film animates some key questions about the role and purpose of AI on a distant battlefield sometime in the future. We invite you to embark with us on this journey to the future and back, because that journey is a bit fraught. And so we have recruited several leading voices to help guide us along the way. To begin, I'm also pleased to welcome the author, futurist, and Atlantic Council non-resident senior fellow, August Cole, who is joining us to help frame our expectations for the film. Then, immediately following the short film, the event will continue with a panel discussion among the film's director, Mark Kiefer, the writer, Jamie Metzl, also a non-resident senior fellow for the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council, and it was his story, A Visit to Weisenbaum, from which this film was adapted, as well as Tess DeBlanc Knowles, another Atlantic Council alum and a director of research and analysis at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. The discussion will be moderated by Atlantic Council Senior Fellow Steve Gutman, who is the executive producer of the film, and I'd like to thank each of these speakers for joining us, and all of you for tuning in virtually. Here at the Atlantic Council, our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security works to develop sustainable nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the US and its allies and partners now, and particularly into the future. The center seeks to honor the legacy of the late General Brent Scowcroft, his legacy of service, which embodies the ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for US leadership in close cooperation with allies, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Consistent with that mission, the Scowcroft Center's forward defense practice seeks to shape the debate around the greatest military and defense challenges facing the US and its allies, and create forward-looking assessments of the trends and the technologies and the concepts defining the future of warfare. That's what this was about. So when we launched Forward Defense last year, we sought to draw upon innovative methodologies such as wargaming, narrative fiction, and the creative arts to both complement traditional analytic tools and also to demonstrate new ways of addressing tomorrow's challenges. We need this kind of vision, we need this imagination, particularly here in Washington. So our film today applies that approach to one of our greatest technological opportunities and challenges, and that is the integration of AI into our strategy, operations, doctrine, and even our lives. And true to the enduring mission of Forward Defense's Art of War project, Source Code expands the discussion about the future of war from the wonders of technology to the roles of humans in that uncertain future, and how do we best find some synergy with artificially intelligent machines. And so to kick us off for our event today, I'll turn it over to August Cole. August is a best-selling author, one of my favorite, and his work explores the future of conflict through fiction and other forms of what some call fictional intelligence, or ficant. With Peter Singer, another amazing author, he is the co-author of the 2015 bestseller Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next World War, which was widely circulated among the defense community, and that's an understatement, and also the 2020 book Burn In, a novel of the real robotic revolution. Here at the Atlantic Council, he previously directed our Art of Future Warfare project, which did much of this kind of work, leveraging creative work for insight into the future. Among the project's achievements was its publication of an anthology of short stories entitled War Stories from the Future. It is in that anthology where Jamie Metzl's story, A Visit to Weisenbaum, first appeared, and that's the basis for this film, which adapted that for what you will see today. In that way, August's work serves as one of the really foundational pillars for our defense work in the Scowcroft Center, and he's the perfect speaker therefore to set the stage for the event today. August, thank you so much, as always, for joining us and for your numerous collaborations with the Atlantic Council, We look forward to hearing your remarks on the role of useful fiction in exploring critical national security challenges. So August, over to you.
Thank you, Barry. Your support for the Council's work using narrative to explore the future of conflict has been unwavering. And the fact that we're here today to be able to talk to this online audience about the great adaptation of Jamie's story is testament to that. That's something that we are seeing more and more of, thankfully, within the larger defense community, because we're at this critical point where I think there's a real appetite to use new tools to think through the future of conflict, especially our relationship with technology. AI itself and the family of technologies within that appellation is incredibly difficult to wrap your hands around, even for a layperson like me. But one of the ways I think that we can better understand it from a policymaker's point of view, from a technologist's point of view, is to really focus on the human aspects. When we start to think through the kinds of futures and tomorrows that we might have, to always be focusing on the actual experience of living in those futures. But how do you do that? You can't build a model to that. And that's where the arts, particularly narrative, written stories or film or even video games, can help us do this. And what we're really trying to do is not identify a discrete or particular technological breakthrough for its narrow impact, but rather understand almost in a holistic sense the kind of tomorrows that we might have. There's a great quote from the science fiction writer Frederick Pohl that was introduced to me by Steve Grunman, who you'll hear from later, who's in many ways the godfather of the Art of Future Warfare project and this effort at the Council. But the quote is this: a good science fiction story should be able to predict not the automobile, but the traffic jam. And to me, that is such a great encapsulation of the challenge that is set forth when we're trying to realistically and credibly envision the kinds of futures that we will be living in or our children will be living in. If you kind of step back for a minute and think through the way that we can actually derive real value out of playing video games, reading novels, writing short stories, writing books, it's worth unpacking a bit the elements that make fiction useful. One of the concepts that I've used to describe this is something called fiction, which is a slightly tongue-in-cheek way to evoke the idea that, yes, fiction can be useful in developing an awareness and understanding about what's coming down the pike, but also the world that we're in today. And that, I think, also reflects this idea that, some of the best science fiction isn't about the future, it's about the present. But this is born of the idea, again, that the human experience is what we need to focus on, especially when we're writing policy, especially when we're thinking about doctrine, especially when we're doing research into technological frontiers. And so to do so, we're going to use one of the oldest technologies of all, of course, which is story. We are literally hardwired as humans to receive it and also to create it. We can point to the examples of how this has been used to develop visions of future war for generations. In the industrial age, we saw H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds contemplating global conflict. The Battle of Dorking by George Chesney in 1871 also envisioned transcontinental warfare. And then in the information age, or the Cold War, really, and it's in that phase of it, you had Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising and Sir John Hackett's The Third World War, both of which really tried to think the unthinkable and envision the very complex but yet realistic ways that a Soviet war with the West might play out. But now we're in the AI era. This is the 21st century it really feels like this next decade and the decade after may decide the following 50 to 60 years. And there's a bevy of new narratives. And what's exciting about this is that not only are these being professionally written and produced, but they're being crowdsourced. They're being developed from a ground up community of others who are invested increasingly in not only professionally creating these kinds of projects, but spending their own time and nights and weekends to look at the future of naval combat, to understand urban warfare in the future. This kind of a groundswell moment, I think, speaks to the really important work that's being done, both from the top, but also from the bottom. And when you look at the way these kinds of short stories, novellas, and other graphic art work is being done, one of the things I think is worth unpacking as well is, how do we understand what makes something useful? Well, I think one of the most important aspects of it is whether it's really based on facts. This is something that is really important to consider, and that's research. The kind of research that goes into a really good piece of useful fiction is as important as you would, do it for a white paper. One of the ways that we've approached that is with endnotes and footnotes. Not the sort of thing you usually find in fiction, but it can be incredibly important for a couple of reasons. One is you're being transparent. You're showing the reader that the things that you're looking at, in fact, are the very rule sets, the very facts, the very trends that are going to be shaping the world as it is. The second is you're building a level of credibility with someone. You've done the hard work so that when you really stretch the imagination and kind of blow their mind, that they're going to go with you on that journey because they understand that what you're positing, even if it's disruptive, even if it's uncomfortable, is in fact rooted in the real. When you understand that, the other aspect of this is being able to transmit these kind of stories, not only broadly and widely, something fiction does really well, it's important to consider is that bad news can travel better sometimes as a narrative too. And one of the big challenges in trying to, for example, communicate a greater truth, something that's been uncovered or not spoken about, is that it's very difficult to brief that upwards. Very few people like getting bad news. We know this from bureaucratic studies and organizations. But if you can wrap some of that in a narrative itself, what you're doing is allowing the kind of insight to penetrate in an organization in a way that isn't going to trigger that sort of autoimmune response, if you want to call it that, of taking an idea and making it essentially disappear. You can see how that can be done, especially if you're thinking about things like vulnerabilities in infrastructure. You can see how that might be done as it is done in Jamie Metzel's short story and now this film. The idea that the human relationship with technology is going to be incredibly fraught and maybe something that is going to, in fact, escape our ability to be able to perfect it. Yet that is very much in an engineering-driven society and paradigm like we have in defense, somewhat the objective. And yet we have to deal with these kind of imperfections that are, of course, core to the human experience. Another aspect of this that's really important too is that there are new perspectives and points of view that can be included in stories that ordinarily aren't. That might be bringing in a writer who isn't the sort of person who's normally in the room during a discussion about a difficult defense issue. It could be allowing the understanding and study of a thematic topic like, let's say, how you would take down a connected city with a cyber attack. Looking at that perspective from the point of view of perhaps the two least connected people in that city, as the writer Madeline Ashby did for one of the anthology stories in War Stories from the Future. Being comfortable with that positional shift, sitting on the other side of the table is incredibly important in all facets of thinking about defense and design, really, but especially so when thinking about the future. And some of the most important questions right now, I think that we're wrestling with, have to do with this human and machine relationship. How much AI and robotics will change society? For me, this is one of the most important questions we need to wrestle with as Americans. It's something I've spent the last few years doing with Peter Singer and Burn-In. And of course, that has, profound implications for warfare. So what we know is that there's going to be a lot of destabilizing forces unleashed by autonomy, whether it's software driven or whether it's robotics. In many ways, the shifting in the social contract that we're already starting to see through COVID in the last year and a half, how Americans and how people around the world relate to government, to work, is fundamentally going to be changing. Well, all those same things are going to be changing within organized militaries too. And that's certainly something that Captain Gallatin will speak to in the movie when you watch it here very soon. Even in itself, this very basic question of what form will warfare take in the 21st century? The operational environment depicted is highly lethal in Jamie's story. And this idea that we are going to be further investing in remote warfare seems to be carried to its logical conclusion in this narrative. And I really think it's worth thinking about and, of course, discussing as you'll have among the panel afterwards. I think I'll close by saying, the Atlantic Council has been long supporting this kind of an approach. And I think it's really heartening to see that a think tank, one is traditional and is rooted in the institutional approaches to foreign policy and defense and security, can be so forward-leaning in this. We've had fellows like Max Brooks and Dave Anthony, known for World War Z and the Call of Duty video games. We've seen, as you can look in the chat, you can download a copy of the anthology, which has short stories by writers like Ken Liu. Of course, A Visit to Weisenbaum, which is the short story that is based, this film is based on, and the story I mentioned by Madeline Ashby, among others. But what it speaks to, though, is that there is a real value in having this kind of work encapsulated. It's the sort of project that you will find, I think, relevant, whether you're looking discretely at issues like artificial intelligence, but also much more difficult and challenging questions like, U.S.-China policy. All of these things will come back to some of these really core questions about how as humans we relate to technology. And it's important, I think, that we make time to read, but also to write to do that. So with that, I will close and turn it back over to you, Barry, and the rest of the panel.
Thanks very much, August. As always, I found your remarks quite illuminating. Before I introduce the film, one more housekeeping note. This event is public, it is on the record, and we encourage our audience to join the discussion.
What words would I use? Really? Are we really doing this? All right. How about complete disaster? Or I don't know, needless tragedy? Does that answer your question? Because that's what it was, as far as I'm concerned.
The colonel says all but 2 of them made it out.
Should have been all of them.
You blame yourself for what happened?
Who else is there?
Why don't you sit down, Captain Gallatin? You might be more comfortable.
That's not going to help, Doctor.
Then perhaps this will. You know they say a man would tell his bartender things he'll never tell his shrink.
I've got to make a report to the colonel in an hour, Doctor. Explain what the hell happened. They don't court-martial me first.
Consider it a prescription.
We both know that stuff has no effect on me.
Well, you've been staring at that fence for 5 minutes. If you're thinking what I'm afraid you're thinking, one of us is gonna need one. Anyway, I need to check you out. Standard procedure after an incident like this. So if you please. Okay. Recording. This is a fitness for duty evaluation. You have the right to review my report to the base commander. Do you understand, Captain?
Yes.
All right. You know the drill. Eyes right here, please. Begin QA diagnostic. Code in, please.
Gallatin, John Robert, Captain. Serial number 424-69227. Echo Bravo Romeo Uniform. Spec code 216.24.
Quantitative battery. 2357.
11, 13, 17, 19.
Stop. 953.
967, 971, 977.
Stop. Verbal battery, site version 427, please.
She sells seashells by the seashore, and the shells she sells are seashells.
Stop. QA diagnostic complete. Well, your levels are still within acceptable limits. Barely. Now let's see about the rest of it. I'm gonna have to tell the colonel something too. So do you want to tell me what happened?
I don't know. I mean, it's like I wasn't all there. Wasn't thinking clearly or quickly, wasn't focused.
You had a lot on your mind lately. Is that fair?
I told myself it had to be over.
But you didn't. You didn't end it.
I saw her. Again.
Elizabeth.
And now this.
So what made you go back to her?
I just couldn't shake it. The experience, the feeling, I guess you'd say. What the hell is wrong with me?
I suspect that may have been a rhetorical question. But if I didn't know better, Captain, I might say you're in love.
We both know that's impossible.
Do we? Well, what word would you use to describe this feeling?
I think the word is alive.
And what about that? Is that possible?
I don't know. Honestly, I've never felt this way before.
And these feelings, you think they compromise your ability to command? ultimately caused this disaster.
You saw what happened.
Well, not entirely. I wasn't there in the room. So perhaps you'll humor me with a little more detail.
When the call came in, I was the duty officer, so they routed it to me. It was a densely populated civilian area, so we've been reluctant.
You were concerned about the loss of innocent life.
I was concerned about... I don't even know anymore. Our job here is pretty simple. We're stuck on this miserable, godforsaken outpost to monitor the terms of engagement in this awful remote control war. We're supposed to do our job so the troops 10,000 kilometers away can do theirs.
But you did your job, didn't you? You gave the order.
Eventually, yes.
Go on.
I haven't been the same. Not the same soldier, not the same... anything, really.
Not the same. So what's different now?
It's like a part of my code that I'd somehow lost has come back to me. Before I met her, I never really thought I had a soul. Does that sound crazy to you?
Well, what do you think? Does it sound crazy to you?
I don't know. Am I losing my mind? Definitely losing my balance.
What happened exactly when you saw her again?
It was like it had been. Only even more intense. She led me far away from here. To places I hadn't known. They were familiar, but like I was discovering them again for the first time. I noticed small things that I'd never cared about. Salt air. Sound of leaves under my feet. Smell of wildflowers in the wind. It was as if she was showing me parts of myself that I didn't know existed. Or even could exist. Like my senses had been dulled and now were heightened. Or just more real. I was finally able to forget about this place.
You know you're not the first soldier to feel this way. Probably not the first on this base either.
Constant alertness. That's what we train for. Drill for, live for. When I got the call, I didn't react right away. And when I did, it was like I was somewhere else. Unfocused, indecisive. It was only a few moments, but...
And you believe that if you didn't have these feelings for Elizabeth, you would have thought more clearly, been more decisive, and those soldiers might have lived?
Yes. Maybe. I can't know for sure. It's complicated.
How so?
We still had to assess the situation, scan for civilians. There's a hospital nearby. It was chaos. But I just wasn't...
And that's why you blame yourself. And why the other side of that fence is looking pretty good right now. And you're thinking what? Maybe the honorable thing is to fall on your proverbial sword, resign your commission, and be free of all this?
It's very perceptive, Doctor. I suppose it's your job, isn't it?
Let's just say it's how I'm wired.
Yeah, that's the thing. I thought I knew how I was wired. Soldier's life, all the order and discipline that comes along with that. Live your life by a simple code. It's just that I guess I didn't know how alone I was until Elizabeth. Another 9 months being quarantined in this place. Really, that seems unbearable.
The reality of that. You do understand you're here for your own protection.
Yeah, of course. I'm an isolation warrior. That's what I signed up for, I know. But at what cost?
And Elizabeth, the reality of her, is she real?
Real. What does that even mean?
Well, is she real to you?
Because I can't reach out and touch her. She only exists in virtual reality. How's that different from the enemy we're fighting? Our targets, a man, a bot, a bridge or building, all just images on the screen. Press a button, there it is. Press another one, it's gone.
But the consequences of all that, aren't they real?
We lost 2 soldiers today, Doctor. It was on my watch. I know where I send people every day, every night. Couldn't be more real. Do you have any idea what that's like? That kind of responsibility?
I wear the uniform, same as you.
That's not what I asked. I meant, do you know how that feels? To be so utterly confused by things you took for granted your whole life. What all this is even for.
I can see that it's eating you up inside, if that's what you're getting at.
No. No, that's not what I mean either. I guess you wouldn't understand.
Perhaps not entirely. We're all in our own way, limited by our code.
You mean you have to report me? I'm fit for duty.
I mean, I have to envy you. Or at least that I would if I knew how.
Wait, what? Why?
It may interest you to know, Captain, that the very thing that you see as a burden, I see as a gift. One I'll probably never comprehend. And at least as best I'm able to understand it. It's why I'm in this chair and you're in that one. Is the name Victor Frankl familiar to you, Captain?
Was he an isolation warrior?
In a way. He was certainly acquainted with war and isolation, deprivation, being stuck in a dreadful place from which he thought he might never escape. He was in Auschwitz.
You mean the...
Yes. His work was a fundamental part of my training. Not because he was a psychiatrist, because he was a survivor. He found a way to retain his humanity, even in that horrible place.
Okay, but what does this have to do?
It has everything to do with you, Captain. This conflict you're feeling is a natural reaction to the stress you're experiencing. When the world is not as you wish it to be, and you feel powerless to change that fact, you suffer. You and everyone like you.
But I don't know what I'm doing here anymore. Those survivors, they must have known they were serving something greater. The very future of democracy, of civilization. Humanity was at stake. They resisted. They fought back in whatever way they could. They stuck it out because they...
Because they what, Captain? Because they had to?
No. Not because they had to. Because they chose to.
Because they chose to. You see, I'm very good at deciding things, Captain. I can run circles around you in doing calculations. But there's a reason you, all you humans, are the only thing standing between home and chaos, and I just run diagnostics. The difference between me and you is that you get to choose for yourself what it all means. Maybe right now you don't know. But you get to choose.
Those people in the camps always wondered why they bothered to go on living. Their life seemed to fate worse than death. They could have just given up. Instead, they chose to be proud. To find honor in their suffering. To find meaning.
Meaning, Captain. That's the one part of your humanity that no one can take away.
It's time to face the music. Gotta go see the Colonel. You said I have a right to see your report. What are you gonna tell him? The Colonel?
Nothing he doesn't already know. That human judgment is still the only oracle we should depend on when human lives are at stake. And what are you gonna tell him?
They don't make androids like they used to.
Bit of an outdated term. But I'll take that as a compliment. And about the mission? What happened?
Well, Doctor, as we Marines like to say, I think shit's about to get real. And I'm okay with that.
And about Elizabeth?
Thanks for the prescription.
Okay. Hi, I am Steve Grundman. I am a senior fellow here at the Atlanta Council. I'm also the proud executive producer of the film you've just watched, which for as many times as I've seen it, I continue to enjoy and realize a smile on my face at its conclusion. Let me congratulate, first of all, Mark Kiefer, the screenwriter and director, filmmaker, who, well, you've seen his work. We can talk a little about how much work that is, probably a lot more than those of you making films on your camera might realize. But congratulations, Mark, a great work that you've achieved there.
Thank you, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Like any film, at least any film that I enjoy, it's worth talking about afterwards. If I walk out of a movie with my family or friends and we immediately start talking about something else, I come to realize that the film, whatever its technical merits, had not made that much of an impression on me. This film, for those of you in the audience who might be scratching your heads or wondering what the heck just went down there, that's good. Maybe it doesn't feel satisfying right now, but part of the purpose of this panel is to give you some more perspectives, to share what are probably our own different perspectives about what went down there and why, and what the meaning and significance of it and relevance to us as people, and perhaps, as many of you may be, as planners in the military or technologists even. So if you're doing a little head scratching, good, you're in a good place to take on this, this panel discussion. Here's what we're gonna do. We have a little less than an hour, which is pretty much just the right amount of time, I think, to do the following four things. I've talked to the panel about this structure of our conversation. I want to give the audience the benefit of understanding the context for the film, both the story, but to some degree also the context in the contemporary conversation over artificial intelligence in national security. In the second segment of our discussion, we'll talk about the film itself. I'll share with you the perspectives of my three panelists. Maybe I'll squeeze a perspective of my own in here and there about what we saw and what went on, what the themes of it were, and not least the choices that the filmmaker made in presenting it to you. And then in the third segment, we'll kind of cast forward, ask ourselves, discuss among ourselves, so what? What did we learn that we can take forward into our lives, our jobs, our institutions from this film? Finally, and hardly least, somewhere at maybe a half hour from now, maybe 10 minutes past 3, I look forward to taking questions from those of you in the audience. My colleague Christian Trotty is actively curating questions that you would type out into the Q&A panel. Those of you not as familiar with with Zoom will notice when you motivate your cursor that a tab will show up at the bottom of the screen that says Q&A. There are 6 questions in there right now. We look forward to more questions from those of you in the audience. Please type them out. As befits an on-the-record event such as this, please identify yourself. Feel free to identify your affiliation, particularly if that adds some context to your question. And I will ask Christian to narrate to us the best of those questions during the 20 or 25 minutes we have left after the top of the next hour. So that's how we're going to go about this. That's how we're going to get questions from you. Let me now, and before I turn to them in turn, introduce you to the panelists, starting with the filmmaker Mark Kiefer, who is a writer and filmmaker who is based in Boston. His short films and comedy sketches, many of which you can see at Mark Kiefer Creative, that logo you can see in his background there, have been screened at film festivals such as, but hardly only, the Nantucket Film Festival, Martha's Vineyard Film Festival, and just this summer, the Woods Hole Film Festival, among others. He was the producer of an indie sitcom pilot, MV Blues. He also has written three feature-length screenplays, one of which is a period drama set in 1930s Germany. I just happen to know Mark is also quite an accomplished business consultant to the transportation sector. Jamie Metzl, the aforementioned Jamie Metzl, is a leading technology and healthcare futurist, geopolitical expert, novelist, entrepreneur, and media commentator who founded the global social movement oneshared.world. He also, as Barry mentioned, is a non-resident senior fellow at the council and a faculty member at the Singularity University. In 2019, he was appointed to the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, in where a lot of his work resides. He has previously served in government on the National Security Council, at the State Department, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, also as a human rights officer for the United Nations in Cambodia. He appears, many of you will recognize him, as he appears regularly on national and international media, including 60 Minutes, the New York Times. He is the author, right? In addition to all of that, he is himself an author, not least of the very story that was adapted into this film. I repeat it again. I think there's a link to it in the chat. It was called A Visit to Weisenbaum. Presently, we're going to ask Jamie to talk more about that origin story, if I may call it that. But also an historical novel, The Depths of the Sea, genetics thrillers Genesis Code and Eternal Sonata, and the nonfiction bestseller Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity. Last, hardly least, is Tess DeBlanc Knowles, our former colleague here at the Council, who is a Director of Research and Analysis at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, an enterprise that was commissioned a year or more ago under the leadership of Eric Schmidt and Bob Work. It published a final report in the spring, but I think, as Tess, maybe you can tell us, presently its work goes on. Her particular focus there was on a line of effort that is focused on maintaining U.S. leadership in artificial intelligence research and development. Prior to joining the NSCAI, she served as the Chief of Staff to the Chief Executive here at the Atlanta Council, Fred Kemp. She also has spent time at the U.S. Special Operations Command. All right, that gets us started here. I said we had 3 parts. Let's start with the context. What's the backstory, if you will, to the story that everybody has seen? Let's start with the origin story. Jamie Metzl, as August made clear, we published a terrific short story of yours, A Visit to Weizenbaum, in 2015. And I tell you, the instant I read that story, I started envisioning it as a one-act play, or as we've ultimately rendered here, a short film. Give us a sense of that origin story of what the audience has just seen on film.
Well, thank you so much, Steve and August and Barry. And particular thank you to Mark. I just absolutely loved the film. This was the second time I'd seen it. And in my mind, it's a mark of a great film where the second time and hopefully the third and fourth time you see it, you see different things and different perspectives. And it's very much an adaptation of my story. I hope everyone will read the story and you'll realize, I believe it captures the essence of the story. But there's a lot of new great stuff that's in Mark's stories. I just think it was, in my mind, it's the model of what an adaptation looks like, taking something from one medium and then not just directly translating it, but interpreting it to make sense in another medium. So as you mentioned, Steve, you and August commissioned me in 2015 for this story, and as you mentioned in your introduction of me, I'm very involved in the future tech world through Singularity University, through my work on human genome editing. But whenever I push on the tech issues, at least for me as a human being, and I think for us, the core question isn't just about the tech. It's actually more about the human. What does it mean to be a human being in an age of really humanized technology? How does our technology reflect us? It's not that there's just humans and technology. Technology is part of us. It's part of our evolution. Some of us maybe have pacemakers and other devices inside of ourselves. So we have this very complex relationship with our technology, as is said in the film. Our humanity is at stake, but it doesn't mean, and it's never meant, that to be a human means we dissociate from our technology. To be a human means that we evolve and we co-evolve with our technology, and so that's what I was trying to explore in this story. I mean, it was kind of nice. We did a prep call last week for this, and Tess hadn't yet had a chance to read the story or see the film, and she's done a lot of work on autonomous AI, which is a huge question, and started raising issues about that. And I said, well, actually, this story, it's not really about the autonomous tech. It's about what does it mean to be a human in that context, when the boundaries between what's human and what's not human, what's real and what's virtual, are really blurry. And when we realize that we're all made up of code of one sort or another, there are three main characters in this in the story and in the film, and they're all made up of code that makes certain things possible and certain things not possible. But it doesn't make any of those people less, or any of them less real in this context. So I really loved doing the story. I loved the adaptation. But let me stop there and look forward to hearing from the others.
That's great. There's several things we're gonna get back to that you've put up on the table. But let's turn to Tess. Tess, as you know from our conversation, I very much wanted someone in this discussion who had worked on the commission, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. There's a link to it in the chat, everybody, at least to the full report. Indeed, surely one of the reasons Barry commissioned me to create this film was because we could see the concentration of attention building on the intersection or the applications of AI in national security, not least because of the commission's work, which again, published in the spring. So say what you want about the film, but don't miss the opportunity to tell the audience what was the commission about, and then maybe in particular what aspects of it, at least at a first glance, intersect or the film speaks to.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for the opportunity to join you today and talk a little bit about the Commission's work. So for those who aren't familiar with the NSCA, or the National Security Commission on AI, it was established by Congress in the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act, and it was given the mandate to examine the ways and means that the U.S. needs to advance AI and machine learning to comprehensively address U.S. national security and defense. And we released, as Steve said, our final report in March, and it's not light reading. It's 750 pages. But what that reflects is that when we started going down this path of looking at the way AI will affect the future, we realized that it affects so many things. And so what we developed was a comprehensive national strategy for the US to navigate the AI era. So what we're talking about here today is the future of warfare. But I want to emphasize that AI is going to have this impact on so much more. It's really the quintessential dual use, or some people say general purpose technology. And the ability of a machine to perceive, evaluate, and act more quickly and accurately than a human is a competitive advantage in any field, so civilian or military. And it's going to fuel economic progress, accelerate scientific discovery, and transform national security. And really harnessing it fully and in a responsible manner takes a whole of nation effort. And also important for the council audience, it will also take strong cooperation with international partners and allies. So what I would like to do is kind of bring into this discussion the Commission's view of the future of war and the role that AI will play, and kind of bring that into a discussion with what was portrayed in the movie. So the Commission viewed the future of war is that this future will have AI enhanced capabilities as the tools of first resort in this new era of conflict. And this is both in terms of strategic competitors who are going to develop AI concepts and technologies for military use, as well as rogue states and terrorists and criminals who can take advantage of cheap and commercially available AI applications for malign purposes, ranging from the deep fakes that you hear a lot about in the media to lethal drones. So the Commission called out in 4 key categories the ways that AI will be integrated into warfighting in the future. First being to help prepare the force. So from the back office process automation, which is already deployed across the commercial sector, to predictive maintenance, to enhance training that can use simulated and blended environments to enhance the way we train our forces. Second, will transform the way we sense and understand information. So that's both on the battlefield at the tactical edge, in the terms of the speed and quality of intelligence exploitation, as well as being able to fuse data from multiple sources, types of intelligence, and classification levels to produce accurate predictive analysis in the way that's not currently possible and is not possible by a human analyst alone. And the Commission judged that intelligence is really going to benefit from AI more than any other national security mission. And third, AI will fuel decision-making. AI decisions support applications, will utilize modeling and simulation algorithms and real-time data to optimize planning options, and integrate command and control networks, and compress the speed of finding and attacking targets of military value. And finally, it will assist in execution from optimizing logistics and sustainment operations for deployed forces to accelerating the targeting chain and improving precision and accuracy of the force. And in public comments recently, Secretary Austin echoed this assessment. He said, AI has a critical role to play in all 4 areas of the joint warfighting concept that he approved this spring. So that includes joint fires, joint all-domain command and control, contested logistics, and an information advantage. And he's spoken about AI as a force multiplier, so one that will help us make decisions faster and more rigorously, and integrate information across all domains. And of course, the Commission really emphasized that while this future must be pursued, it must also be pursued in a manner that's responsible, doesn't cut corners on safety, security, or ethics. Many of today's current AI systems are very narrow in terms of their abilities, and they're brittle when asked to perform functions outside of what they're trained on. So AI require rigorous testing, safeguards, and an understanding of how systems might operate differently in real world than in the test beds that they are developed in. One point that really resonated in terms of the film as it closes, that the Commission also underscored, is that human judgment must be involved in decisions when human life is involved. So there must be processes that rely on appropriate levels of human judgment in the use of AI-enabled or autonomous weapon systems. And that human operators of such systems remain accountable for the results of their employment, which I think was a very similar message that the film went out on.
Okay, that is exactly what I was hoping for, to give the audience that further context about the film. I commend the report, all 700 pages of it, but it's also got a very tidy and complete executive summary, one can rest assured, which is how I consumed it. It's great. Mark, again, last point here on the context for the film, and I wouldn't mind a little of the tradecraft of filming. What's been your journey developing this film from its page or on the page as a visit to Weizenbaum to the screen? Maybe, I mean, there's more. We haven't the time to tell the whole journey, but give us a few highlights of that journey.
Sure. And first, Steve, thank you very much for this great opportunity. It was indeed a lot of work, but a lot of fun as well. And so I really appreciate it. It's been a great journey. Thank you very much to Barry for his leadership in this program, which is, I think, doing wonderful things. As August, thank you as well, nicely articulated the value of using the creative arts and narrative to explore these complex issues. And not least, thank you very much, Jamie, for writing this terrific story and inspiring this film, which was a delight to adapt and to work on. And with that, I think any adaptation is a big challenge. It's a great challenge, but it's a big challenge in at least two ways. And the first is sort of finding the story within the story, as it were. And Jamie very nicely summarized it a moment ago. I think the theme that we ultimately settled on, the core, the kernel, is what does it mean to be a human? And particularly in an increasingly technology-dominated world. And that's something we're grappling with right now. And I dare say we need to figure out if we're to successfully navigate this further transition into the future. And so it's not certainly a simple visual rendering of the story that Jamie has written, but rather taking the hard work that he's done to explore these themes in the context of his stories and sort of extrapolating them. So it is as much, in a way, a sequel as it is an adaptation, in the sense that, and I think maybe Jamie will talk a little bit more about further about the origin story and Weizenbaum, but what is 40 years hence the legacy of the earliest developments in artificial intelligence? What will this look like? What does our future look like? And then secondly, and maybe equally importantly, is film is a visual medium. And while it's a visual medium, it couldn't possibly compete with the power of our own imagination. So we need a means by which to visually render the story that Jamie has written. And that was sort of a lot of work to sort of figure out sort of how to do that. I won't spoil it for you, but instead recommend very much that you all read Jamie's story. You got the link in the chat there, or the Q&A, where you can find it. It has itself some really interesting visual elements that in the end we didn't choose to try to render here, but instead the sort of visual landscape that we wanted to try to convey was that of the isolated, quarantined soldier. That is to say, the crucible that is this small concrete room in an equally small and remote military base, and the pressure that he was feeling, and the distress that he was under. And I think of certain films that I really like. Fury, which is a film about World War II, a tank with Brad Pitt, or U-571, which is about submariners in World War II. And it's a similar context where the crucible of the small confined space is in effect a powerful device to confront the characters with their own realities and so forth. And so that's kind of where we landed in visualizing the film.
Let me pick that up and use this question as the pivot over to chapter 2 of our conversation about the film itself. I've heard it said, Mark, I've seen it play out this way, that screenwriting is a craft of problem solving. And if it doesn't feel like you're having to grapple and solve a problem, you're probably not writing a great screenplay. what was, and maybe you've just said it, but let me ask it, what was the problem once you started trying to put the story onto film? What's the problem that needed solving, or at least one that you struggled most with?
Well, I think, picking up on that theme of what does it mean to be human, screenwriting is, in a sense, it is like an engineering problem, in that you have to work out how you get where you want to go in the story, with, in effect, two basic principles that are somewhat, maybe almost at odds with each other. You want to provide just enough information to keep people interested, but not so much that you sort of give it away. And I think I already saw a comment in the Q&A, the question about, at first it didn't seem it was clear who the robot was, who the android was. Was that intentional? And the short answer is yes, very much. Again, picking up on something Jamie said before, we call the film source code in part because whether we realize it or not, we all have software as human beings. And so we're not really different from the machines with which we interact in that regard. And so how do we keep it a secret? Who's the android? Well, laying the groundwork such that when we find out who it is, it's neither a surprise nor unbelievable, and so forth. And at the same time, we're trying to convey this is no ordinary android. It's one of our imagination that extrapolates the rapid advances in technology that are happening now for several more decades. And what kind of characteristics does this very, very sophisticated machine have? And what does it look and feel like when it actually interacts with a real human? And so that's what we were trying to engineer, which I hope successfully.
Let me pass one of the questions you've teased right over to Jamie. Actually, I got two questions. Looking at my clock and indeed promising to keep the audience questions involved here, I will pick the pace up a little. I'm going to combine two questions that I think the audience will be interested in your answer to, Jamie. One is Weisenbaum. What's he? And the question I've actually been looking forward to asking you, and that is, what's love got to do with it? How did love get into this story, and why?
Yeah, so after we'll ask you to sing that question, channeling Tina Turner. But so Joseph Weisenbaum was a MIT professor and a very important person in the evolution of artificial intelligence, and particularly the relationship between humans and even rudimentary AI. And in the mid-1960s, Weisenbaum, who was born born in Germany, which is also relevant to our story and certainly to the film, he created a very rudimentary first-generation AI, and it was essentially a therapy robot based on the psychology, the philosophy of Carl Rogers. And it was just very simple mathematical equations where they would take the things that were said and have not a huge number of options for responding. It reminds me of the joke from Something About Mary, where the therapist is just saying, but this way, it wasn't the most sophisticated stuff.
Right. But the original chatbot,
the original basic Carl Rogers thing, asking some open questions, pivoting on what things people said. And it was incredible for him watching how even with those rudimentary prompts, people became incredibly emotionally connected to this essentially an AI. And it became the connection was so deep and emotional that it actually became very disturbing to Weisenbaum. And he ended up shutting this down. He wrote a book about the challenges and the dangers, among other things, of the human AI interactions. And so in the original story, the actual I don't believe we hear or see the name of the therapist in the film, but in the story, the therapist's name was Dr. Weisenbaum, which was a little bit of like banging the reader over the head with a
little cheeky.
I apologize for that. But I was just kind of playing with this issue that I think Mark did a wonderful job of exploring in the film, is what are all of our codes? And it's certainly, so Weisenbaum is the doctor. Gallatin is the name of the captain, which some of you will know. the story from the 19th century, Pygmalion. Originally, the play was Pygmalion and Galatea. Then it became Pygmalion, and then obviously My Fair Lady comes from that. And so Gallatin that's the thing, is in Pygmalion and Galatea, Gallatin is the statue that becomes a human. So there was playing with that issue of what's real. And then Eliza was the name of, obviously, Eliza Doolittle, but with the same root. That was the program that Weisenbaum created. And then Elizabeth is this VR character. But everybody in the story and in the film, everybody is real. Like, it's not that there's one entity, including Gallatin, who is just the real thing, because Gallatin, his code gets unlocked through this experience of love. And even though the love object for him is Elizabeth, who is a VR creation in the story, at least, Elizabeth has been infused with all of the interactions she's had with previous isolation warriors in the base. So she has kind of captured their essence and their longings. And then the doctor is also very, very real. And I talked about how great of a job I thought Mark did with the adaptation. When I first saw the film, I thought, oh, it's so great that he decided to use my reference in the story to Viktor Frankl. But then after that, because I talk about Viktor Frankl and Primo Levi all the time, and then afterwards I reread the story and I thought, oh, geez, I don't mention Viktor Frankl in the story. It was so, I think he did such a great job of capturing that essence of what's real. What does it mean to be isolated right now in an era of COVID, where so many people are either isolated or we have relationships that are kind of virtual, people we've never met, and yet they're very, very intimate. So for me, Weisenbaum was an early point in this very intimate renegotiation of the ongoing relationship between humans and technology. And then love, I mentioned it. Love is the ultimate human feeling, right? But we can love all sorts of things. People love pet rocks. People, and I just feel, I mean, the movie Her, I think, did a great job of that. Like, who knows what love is? Who knows what's possible for us in the realm of love? But we have all kinds of interactions, and love and every human emotion is at play.
Yeah. One of I said I might sneak in a couple of my own observations. I'll tell you both that the greatest pleasure I take in the film is the realization, the significance of which I know not, that the human envies the calculus, the capacity for calculation and whatnot of the robot. He doesn't say so, but he plainly regrets his mistakes in making choices and not making choices in decision making and calculating. And the robot envies the human capacity for grasping meaning, or for that matter, potentially for love, for true love. Yeah. Anyway, I like that irony pleases me.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in, Steve, it's ironic that the human is both the weakest link and the strongest link in the story and in this whole situation. The reason why Gallatin is an isolation warrior is because humans are so easily manipulable and targetable, and that's why they're in this environment of extreme isolation. So it's the weakest link, and yet it's the strongest link for the reasons that Tess and Mark have articulated, that there has to be some human in this process somewhere. And that's why I loved the language that Mark added at the end of the story of whatever shit's about to get real. The irony of that is everything that's happened before, which they've started where they've been saying, well, what's real and what's virtual, that has in fact been the real stuff. And when he goes back to life being real, he's going back to that same kind of hybrid virtual environment.
Yeah. Tess, you had the advantage, if I can call it that, over Jamie and Mark of coming to the material really more fresh. You're a better proxy for our audience, which, by the way, after Tess's response, we're going to take your questions. I see them piling up there, Christian, so get at the ready. And we'll come back to the third chapter of our conversation at the very tail end of the 90 minutes here. So Tess, let me just ask you, watching the film, particularly the first time you watched it, what mattered? What stuck out? What themes seemed important to you?
Yeah, well, as Jamie previewed, I came at it thinking, oh, this is going to be about autonomous weapons and these like really dynamic battlefields. And then I was, warned that that's not what it was about. And so when I sat down to take it in, it really did. I was primed by our conversation about what does it mean to be human? And it made me think, as someone who lives and breathes AI policy, what can I take away from there in terms of the design of AI and the way humans and machines can work together in the best way to have AI augment human capabilities. And I think that the movie does a great job, the film does a great job of really like the doctor said, I can run circles around you in computation. AI can, sift through massive amounts of data and pull together patterns that a human analyst couldn't. But how can we pair that with the human strength of an emotional intelligence, the ability to love, the ability to envy, and how can we bring those together to have the most effect and really leverage AI for national security and all the other impacts that AI can have. And I think that has a lot of, that brings a lot to how we approach AI research and development and how we think about doing human-centered design and how we can optimize the way that humans cooperate with AI and what that means for training as well, and education of the broader population, not just the workforce or the soldiers who will be partnering with AI.
Excellent. Thank you. Gosh, I have to resist my temptation to keep asking my own questions because I promised the audience we would get theirs in. So let's let Christian Trotty is the assistant director, one of the assistant directors of the Forward Defense Practice. Christian, you are curating questions. What do we got? Let's and panelists, let's do these in sort of a lightning round so we can get as many of them as possible.
Sure, I encourage the audience to keep them coming. Thank you, Steve, and thank you to the panelists. I'll start with a question from General Charles Hooper, senior fellow here with Forward Defense at the Atlantic Council and the former director of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. He asks, the AI in this story reflected a distinctly American linguistic, ethical, and cultural foundation, even describing the doctor's perspective as reflecting a Judeo-Christian perspective. Wouldn't AI avatars developed by other cultures, like China, for example, reflect their own cultural and linguistic origins? And how would that affect AI's ability to relate to each other and to on the battlefield?
I think I'd like to ask each of Jamie and Tess to give a quick answer. Can culture be programmed? Jamie?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely yes. And certainly there will be many different personalities, styles, inputs of our AIs in the future. And it's a design question of how do we design them. But my guess is people will want to interact with AIs that are culturally more familiar to them. But all of these questions are really up in the air, and human culture is massively complex, like human biology is massively complex, but it's not infinitely complex. And I talk about this a lot in different contexts. The complexity of our biology has been relatively constant for millions of years, but the sophistication of our tools is continually increasing at an exponential rate. And the same is true for culture and a lot of other things. So if we should continue that into the future, which I believe is quite likely, that kind of nuance, these things that we feel are distinctly human, not all of them, but a lot of them are going to be embedded into different kinds of code interactions. And maybe in some circumstances that'll seem like, well, this is human or almost human. And in other circumstances, it'll be just another thing. Like nobody is evaluating their dog, other than actually than a few people I know, of whether they're bad humans or good humans. They're just great dogs. And I just think that AI will develop its own personality, which may be a reflection of ours. And there's this whole uncanny valley debate, but certainly will be its own thing. And we will interact with AIs as that thing in the most intimate ways going forward.
Tess, did you want to add something in response to General Hooper's question?
Sure. Just quickly, I think, yes, technology reflects the humans that create it, right? And we see this today in terms of biases that show up in AI tools because of the data that it was trained on. Because, if you're just pulling in all this data from the internet, the AI is trained on some of these societal ingrained biases that are present. And so how can you account for that in your design process, and how can you control for that in whatever you build? I think there's also a question here that around artificial general intelligence and whether that is a possible future. I think it's still in the research realm, it's still an open question as if we'll get there, if we'll get to the type of AI that is depicted in the film and that we've been talking about, or whether we'll even get close to it. So I think that's an important point to bring into this conversation. Today's AI is very narrow, it's brittle. We're getting to a little bit more generalizable capabilities from some of these big language models, OpenAI's GPT-3 that can write essays and answer questions and tweet. But again, we don't have AI that can learn, that can infer things, that can learn intuitively. It doesn't take a child playing something 1,000 times to learn it, but it does take an AI. So I think that it's an important caveat to add to this conversation of, whether that is the future of AI.
Okay. Christian, what's next from the audience?
Sure. Next question is from a student at King's College London, Emily Cashel. She asks, if war is a fundamentally human endeavor, how does the virtualization of warfare and life, as shown by Elizabeth and the element that she brings to the story, change the fundamental nature of it?
Yeah, so I'm going to start again. If Jamie, if you would pick this up, because I know the dimensions of reality, my crude way of describing what's in play here is something that inspired perhaps, but certainly we've talked about. And then I'd also like to hear Mark's view on this question.
Yeah, my answer is actually quite short to this, is that we fight wars, we have conflicts within the contexts in which we live. We used to do it one way, then our society's evolved, our technology is evolved, and we did it in different ways. And so in many ways, these AIs and all new technologies are new tools. And the danger is, well, if we do the old thing, which is fight each other to the death over various issues, which was bad enough when we were doing it with rocks and stones and bows and arrows, but we do it with the tools that we now have and will have with their level of power. It could provide an existential level risk to all of us. So I think that the core issues of war and war fighting are the same. And the question you mentioned, One Shared World, what One Shared World is trying to do is to ask, can we address the global collective action problem? Because connecting to what Tess was saying about what's the right thing to do with autonomous killer robots and AIs, the right thing to do is not do it. But if you're the defense minister of any country, anywhere, you have a terrible choice, because if you do it, there's a real possibility these AIs at some point will get out of control. I mean, that's the Terminator future. But if you don't do it, the first war that you have with some other society that's done it, you're going to lose, and you're going to lose everything. So it's really big issues. They aren't new issues, but given the power and implications of our technologies, they create a new urgency to address them in even more meaningful ways.
Mark, I actually want to extrapolate the audience question to something I'd be interested in. I think the audience would be interested in your answer to, and that is, who was the actress who played Elizabeth? I didn't see her in the credits. Why not?
Right. The short version is she is taken from stock footage. And so appropriately, well, two things. One is we thought, well, what does virtual reality look like 40 years hence? I think it's probably safe to say it will look just like the real thing. It's pretty close already, but I think appropriately, we used just existing stock footage from a stock footage house to render this character. So to Jamie's earlier point, she's real, just as any character in a book would be that you get to know. She is real in that sense, and yet she is manufactured, maybe even more than the audience would have realized.
We manufacture her. If any of you in the audience are in film school, I promise you, there's a semester's dissertation to be written about the dimensions of reality in source code. Christian, next.
Sure. So I'm going to combine two questions here because they're both about the way in which AI might make war harder or easier for humans to conduct in the future. I guess we can call them moral hazard questions. The first, from Michael Shea Kim, is about how the psychiatric analysis of veterans for this kind of warfare, such as pilots of armed drones or the implementers of casualty producing or infrastructure targeting cyber attacks, how should their potential trauma or their perspectives factor into our decision making as we develop these systems? On the other end, Eric Michelson asked if AI can make war easier to conduct. We're not as worried about consequences, more isolated from the target, and what that might happen and how that might affect the way we approach security challenges.
So, Tess, did you or the commission adopt a point of view in response to these kinds of questions?
So we didn't get into the warrior question, and I might kick it over to Jamie after I provide a few comments because I know that he's thought about this a bit. But when it comes to the effect that AI will have on the battlefield, I think it gets to this debate around, are AI-enabled weapons or tools that use on the battlefield able to be developed and used in line with international humanitarian law? And the commission's perspective was yes, because you could use these type of weapons to bring more clarity to the battlefield, really reduce the fog of war, and bring a little bit more precision so that you are actually able to conduct warfare in a manner that reduces civilian casualties. So that was the position of the commission. As Jamie mentioned, there's a lot of debate on this issue. So I'm sure there are other perspectives on the panel as well.
Jamie, did you have a word on that? Please.
Just that I totally agree in principle with what Tess just said. It's a good enough answer because it's hard to completely opt out when we know that the Chinese and the Russians are moving headlong into the development of these technologies for use in warfighting. But ultimately, the goal of fighting wars is winning wars. And that's the problem that we face. That just like I said earlier, the human in this story is the strongest link and the weakest link. We're going to make real important choices. We may not even recognize the choices that we're making as choices because code is cumulative, just like Elizabeth in this story represents an accumulation of code across generations. And frankly, all of the AIs that we're interacting with do. Nobody just sits down and writes all the code from zero. They take bits and pieces and backbones. And I think that's the real question, is what are the pressures going to be on all of us to fight wars differently, or in the best case scenario, and again, I invite people to the One Shared World Global Summit, I'll put the link in the chat, on Thursday, is there a model where we can imagine not fighting wars, about some new form of organization that can recognize that conflict is inevitable, but destructive world war hopefully is not, and AI might be able to help us in this process. It could be something that leads to our destruction. And the difference between those two outcomes is now. It's having conversations like this. It's people taking a step back and thinking, what does it mean? What does it mean for me? And that's why it's wonderful that we're doing this. It's wonderful that Mark has made such a fantastic film that can get people not just to think about these issues, to feel about them, because we have a lot of work to do to try to move toward the kind of future that we want. But it will be very unfamiliar based on our reality today, just like our reality today is fundamentally different from the reality of our hunter-gatherer ancestors.
Christian, let's take one more question from the audience, and then I am going to come back to the third chapter I'd advertised, which is to ask the panelists to think forward from this, its significance. So one more question from the audience, Christian.
Sure. David Satterley asks, how do we manage when an adversarial army does not require a lethal AI to include human participation in the kill decision loop?
Right. So that is a version perhaps of or it picks up from inadvertently, unwittingly, the point you made, Jamie, about how competitors of ours may not impose on themselves the same constraints. I wonder if I could take that question and just turn it a quarter turn. I think there is an open argument in the field of AI, and certainly it's an argument that the film asks us to undertake about which is more efficacious in respect to war fighting. An entity that can make optimal, in the words of your script, Mark, decisions, or an entity that can make good choices. The oracle, only human beings, I can't quite quote the line, Mark. I'm going to turn to you first, Mark. You have a point of view on that. You, Mark, I think, or at least, I'm sorry, whether you do personally, you created a point of view in the film about which of those is more efficacious. Or did you? Why don't you just pick up there, and then I'll ask both Tess and Jamie to give us their perspective on that argument, that issue in the development of AI, what actually would be more efficacious, particularly in the context of war fighting. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, this kind of gets back to, and I suspect, Tess has thought a lot about this, the so-called trolley problem when you talk about autonomous vehicles and so forth, and, would you flip a switch to kill one person instead of 10 and so forth. But at the end of the day, I mean, I really like what Jamie said, that the human is both the weakest link and the strongest link. The advantage of precision munitions is that they will go exactly where you tell them to. The danger of precision munitions is they'll go exactly where you tell them to. And so if you don't realize you've told them to go to a hospital, it's a big problem, right? On the other hand, we know that there are judgments that can have terrible consequences. But I think at the same time, we know there are judgments that when humans make them, we know we reaffirm the value of humans in the loop. I think of the so-called Miracle on the Hudson and Captain Sully Sullenberger and the one-word answer to the air traffic controller, which is unable. And he made that decision very, very quickly, but it was a judgment call and saved the lives of everybody on the plane. So, yeah, I think there will always be an open question as to the relative benefits of human judgment versus the cold calculation of the computer. But I think the point of view here is we need somebody to answer for those decisions. And that somebody better be a human. And just as almost a basic sort of social contract level, kind of idea. And that's kind of, I think, what we're trying to tease out here in the film, rather than preach about it, but just have a point of view, as you say.
Tess, you said even before, if I heard you correctly, that was kind of the point of view of the commission on this question as well. Is that correct?
That's right. And I think another point the commission tried to make strongly was the power of human-machine teaming. So how can we design AI in a way that it augments human judgment and human capabilities, and you have the combined strength of humans and AI, and then together that's the stronger output in the end.
And Jamie, am I wrong that there's a fierce debate among people following AI as to what ultimately will be most efficacious?
Yeah, not only that, there will be an answer to this question because warfighting is the ultimate competitive environment. And just like with the Olympics, we've seen there are different strategies. There's the Soviet Chinese strategy where you identify people when they're really young. We have our strategy. We have a bunch of sports teams. And then we have the Olympics and we figure out what's the better societal form of organization that can achieve a desired outcome. And we may not want it to be the case that taking kids away from their parents and training them in Olympic sports schools delivers the best answer, but maybe it is. And we find out every 4 years. And so warfighting is a domain where there's an answer to the question of have we organized in the right way. And it may be, I certainly hope that what Mark and Tess have articulated is the right answer. There's a part of me, I have a gut feeling, well, it should be the right answer. I hope it's the right answer. Maybe it is the right answer, but we're going to find out. I mean, I hope not, but that's what happens when there is conflict. And that's why this negotiation between what should be and what will be, we don't have an answer, but I think that's the real challenge of this moment. And that's why the framing of the film, I thought worked really well, that it's about humanity. It's about the shit's about to get real. And if we want to optimize our outcomes, we have a lot of work to do now.
That's great. Although I'm going to say, on the one hand, but there's even a distance, if I can pick up one of the themes that stuck with me from the film, there's even a distance between the outcome of, say, a battle and its meaning, which might be the ultimate arbiter of who wins the war. It's right? Anyway, let's wrap on a fairly quick rendering because I want to give the audience something that I promised in respect to that third chapter. But here's how I'm going to ask it. Right, what's the moral of the story from what, in respect to whatever dimension of it that you would like our audience to take away and keep arguing about among themselves? I'll start with you, Mark. What's the moral of the story? What's the key moral of the story, or at least one?
Well, to me, I'd just like to circle back to something that Jamie talked about earlier, which is, and I'll just repeat what I said before, we all have software. I think our task as humans in the next years to come is in fact to do the reverse of what we're talking about here. We're talking about how do we create technology for the betterment of the world. I think our task equally urgently is to hack our own biology, to understand, to rewrite, if you will, our own source code so that we don't get into these kind of conflicts in the first place.
Tess.
I think the policy moral of the story for me, and I'm going to be the policy wonk that I am, is that it's good. Education and workforce development is key. We have to teach our whole population how to interact with AI, how to design AI properly, and how to have the skills to know what's real, what's not real, when to trust the AI, when to not trust the AI, and that's what's really going to set us up for the future.
Thank you. I know you've got to go, Tess, so if you sign out, we'll all understand, Jamie. But thank you, Tess. Thank you very much. What's your moral? What's the moral of your story?
The question is, what does it mean to be a human being in a technological age when technology can do a lot of things that we can do, but technology can do many things better than we can? And I think we're going to have to decide and define for ourselves what's the core of our humanity. And then we're going to need to construct lives and worlds that can achieve that balance. We shouldn't be competing with AI to do pattern recognition. But these issues of what does it mean to be a human being, to love, to create, to emote, all of those things are going to be a little bit different in that world. And we need to start getting ready for it because it's already here and it's coming with an increasing velocity.
All right. Well, thank you, all of you who've been here on the screen. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Tess, Mark, Jamie, Christian Truddy. Thank you very much. Not least, of course, I want to thank the audience and encourage them maybe as Jamie had suggested, is fruitful, watch it again. See if you see something different or see the whole thing differently with the further context and conversation that we've had here. I certainly hope you will. I hope you'll share it with friends you think may take an interest in it. At the very same link where you registered for this event today, you'd be able to watch the movie again and again. And ultimately, I'm sure, Christian, it'll show up on YouTube somewhere. Lastly, although I realize I'm in overtime at this point, I want to tell you what the next event in the Art of War project is. It's something a little bit different, pulling us all the way from 2065 to 2021. And that is productions across the country of the stage play War Words. War Words is a play that is based on the playwright Michelle Collis Brooks's interviews with veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. It is a play which, in the words of General David Petraeus, one of the great fans of this work, does a great job of helping shorten the distance between ordinary Americans and their professional warriors. We at the Atlanta Council are producing stage reading performances of this play in, I hope, as many as 7 cities across the country during the week of Veterans Day. And I don't mind plugging the fact that I need help underwriting the performances in New York and Los Angeles. So any of you in New York or Los Angeles who can help finance this great work, which is a terrific entertainment to begin with, but it also really does do some civic lifting of the sort that attracts General David Petraeus to the work. I would appreciate you sending me a note, giving me a call. Maybe, Christian, you could drop my email address real quick right there into the chat so that anyone who is inspired to respond to what I've just asked for could do that. All right, everybody, this was great. Met all and more of my expectations of this project. Once again, Mark, thanks. Great work. Thanks to all of you. Have a great afternoon.